2,000 years before the digital age, the Roman Empire perfected a system that could starve a citizen with a single scratch on a lead tablet. Imagine the heart of the Roman Forum. The air is thick with the scent of roasting grain and the suffocating dust of 1,000,000 marching feet. In a cramped, marble-walled office, tucked away from the sunlight, a scribe sits hunched over a heavy table. His hand, stained with ink and grit, hovers over a small piece of lead. His stylus trembles, and with one sharp, decisive movement, he carves a symbol into the metal. This is not a simple administrative record. This is a judgment. We often believe that mass surveillance and the control of human resources are inventions of the modern era, tools of the Silicon Age, right? We think of algorithms and digital databases, but the shadows of the Roman Forum held a secret far more chilling. Long before the first computer was ever conceived, the Romans had already mastered the art of social engineering through the belly. How could an ancient civilization control the hunger of 1,000,000 people with nothing more than lead and ink? The answer lies in the tesserae. To a casual observer, these were merely small, unassuming tokens, but in the reality of the Roman streets, they were the keys to the annona, the grain dole that kept the city from collapsing into chaos. These tokens represented the world's first true social credit score. You see, this was a system where your survival depended entirely on your standing in the eyes of the state. If you were loyal, if you were useful, if you were deemed worthy by the bureaucracy of the emperor, you held a piece of lead that guaranteed your next meal. But for those who fell out of favor, the consequences were absolute. To have your name struck from the register, to have your tesserae confiscated, was to be erased. It was a sentence of slow, public starvation in the gutters of the Subura. The stakes were higher than we can even imagine. I mean, think about it. The emperor didn't need a secret police to keep you in line. He only needed to control the lead that decided if you could eat. As we peel back the layers of dust from these ancient artifacts, we begin to see a terrifyingly familiar pattern. This is the story of how the greatest empire on earth turned food into a weapon, and how a tiny scrap of lead became the ultimate tool of imperial control. To walk the streets of Rome at its zenith was to walk through a city of marble and gold, a testament to man's absolute conquest over the chaos of the natural world. At the heart of this splendor lay a promise, a sacred pact between the emperor and his people, known as the cura annone, the care of the grain. To the average citizen, this wasn't just a policy. It was a miracle. It was the assurance that as long as the Roman eagle soared, no child would go to bed hungry. The marble monuments of the Forum depict the emperor as a divine father, his hands outstretched, pouring a literal river of wheat into the laps of the grateful. It was the golden age of bread and circuses, a spectacle of generosity that defined the Roman identity.
But the sheer scale of this operation, it was staggering. Every year, hundreds of massive merchant ships, the true leviathans of the ancient Mediterranean, set sail from the sun-drenched ports of Egypt. They were laden with hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, the lifeblood of the empire, harvested from the fertile banks of the Nile. This was an armada of survival. When those white sails finally appeared on the horizon at the port of Ostia, it was a moment of national celebration. The emperor was the sun, the provider, the one who tamed the seasons and the tides to keep the bellies of 1,000,000 people full. Yet, beneath this grand facade of imperial charity, there was a meticulous, almost obsessive level of organization that the public rarely saw. In the shadowed halls of the grain administration, thousands of scribes worked by flickering candlelight, their styluses scratching incessantly against wax tablets and papyrus. They weren't just counting sacks of wheat. They were counting people. Every citizen eligible for the dole was cataloged with terrifying precision. These records were guarded more fiercely than the imperial treasury itself. For centuries, we viewed these archives as simple bureaucracy, the necessary paperwork of a massive city. But as we look closer at the surviving fragments, a chilling question emerges. Why were these lists so heavily protected? And why, in the margins of these ancient ledgers, do we find the names of thousands of citizens systematically crossed out, their right to eat vanished with a single stroke of ink? The answer lies in a hidden mechanism of the Roman state, one that turned a gift into a leash. Because while the grain was free, it came with a price that wasn't measured in coins. Indeed, the true cost of a Roman's dinner was something far more precious. The true power of Rome did not reside in the ironclad fist of its legions, nor within the golden halls of the Senate. No, it lived in a far more shadow-filled office, the magistry of the censor. To the modern ear, a censor is just someone who redacts a document, right? But to an ancient Roman, the censor was the architect of the soul. These were men of unparalleled gravity, chosen only from the most elite elder statesmen. Their duty was the regimen morum, the regulation of public morals. They didn't just count heads, they weighed spirits. When you stood before the censor during the lustrum, the 5-year purification ritual, you weren't just providing a census of your property, you were undergoing a moral audit. Every aspect of your life was open to scrutiny. How you treated your slaves, the luxury of your dinner table, even the way you spoke to your wife. And if the censor found your character wanting, he wouldn't reach for a sword, he would reach for his pen. With a single stroke of ink, a censor could place the nota censorsa next to your name. This was the black mark of infamy. It was a social death sentence. To receive the nota was to be stripped of your rank, removed from your voting tribe, and cast into the darkness of the aerari, the class of citizens who paid taxes but held no rights. And for the thousands who relied on the state's grain dole, that mark meant the end of their survival. The bread was snatched from their hands, not because they were poor, but because they were deemed simply un-Roman. But the censors were not gods. They could not see behind every closed door. To maintain this pervasive social credit system, the state relied on a more insidious force, the delatores. These were the professional informers, the eyes and ears of the regime, who haunted the forums and the taverns.
Rome transformed into a city of whispers. A neighbor wasn't just a friend, they were a potential witness. A disgruntled slave wasn't just a worker, they were a direct line to the state's judgment. If a delatore reported that your lifestyle was too lavish or your loyalty was wavering, well, the machinery of the censors would begin to turn. This created a neighborhood watch system where the price of a single dissenting word was the erasure of your family's lineage and the starvation of your children. Yet, as this atmosphere of fear began to suffocate the city, the Roman people began to realize that the lists were changing. The criteria for who was moral and who was a traitor started to shift in a terrifying direction, because while the censors claimed to be protecting the soul of Rome, they were actually preparing the way for something much darker. But even as the censors scoured the streets for moral failings, a new kind of hunger was beginning to take root in the heart of the city, a hunger that no amount of grain could satisfy. And it was about to lead the empire toward a tipping point from which there was no return, because the system was about to turn on the very men who created it. The grain was not a gift, you know, it was a leash. In the shadows of those great marble columns, survival was forged in cold, unyielding lead. Imagine standing in the blistering, suffocating heat of the Roman Forum, your hand clenched white-knuckled around a small, circular disc. To a passing merchant, it looked like a worthless piece of scrap, right? But to a Roman citizen, this was the tessera frumentaria. It was far more than mere metal. It was the razor-thin line between the warmth of a full stomach and the slow, hollow, bitter ache of starvation. Consider this, was the world's very first social credit score, and the price of admission was your absolute submission to the state. The tessera was a weaponized social contract. It didn't just prove you were a citizen, it proved you were a compliant one. To hold this token, you had to be a good Roman, a definition that shifted at the whim of the censor.
He was the official who held the ledger of your life. He didn't just count the population, he weighed their worth. He monitored your debts, your military records, even your public decency. If the censor decided your life lacked gravitas, your name was struck from the roll, and your token was simply reclaimed. The surveillance was woven into the very fabric of the streets, everywhere you looked. If you were caught in a forbidden tavern, the kind of place where the desperate whispered of change, your family would find the grain depots closed to them. If you failed to honor the state gods with the proper sacrifices, the divine favor of the empire was withdrawn, and so was your bread. Even a stray word spoken against the prefect in the heat of the market could render your tessera useless. These unassuming lead discs turned every neighbor into a potential informant and every meal into a dense test of political loyalty. It was a master stroke of social engineering, a system that used the most basic human need, the need to eat, to crush the very idea of dissent. These small, unassuming tokens held a terrifying power of life and death, turning the Roman breadline into a silent battlefield of obedience. But as the empire's hunger grew, the authorities realized that the tessera could do more than just feed the loyal. It could be used to erase the undesirables entirely, and there was one specific group of citizens, people just like you or me, who were about to find out exactly how cold the state's mercy could truly be.
Imagine the heat rising from the sun-baked stones of the Roman Forum. The air is thick with the smell of roasting grain, open sewers, and the metallic tang of fear. You see, you are Marcus, a simple artisan living in the Subura district. You walk with your head down, acutely aware that your life is not your own. It belongs to the state, tracked by an invisible web of bureaucracy that spans the entire Mediterranean. There are no computers in Rome, you know, no glowing screens to track your digital footprint. Instead, there is the vicus. Each neighborhood is governed by an overseer, a vigilant shadow who watches your associations, your trade, and your whispers in the taverns. If you buy wine from a man known to frequent the underground meetings of political dissidents, the overseer knows. If you fail to show the proper deference to an imperial official, the overseer knows. The information flows like blood through veins, moving from the neighborhood magistrates up to the formidable scribes stationed within the Temple of Saturn. These men, these are the architects of your social standing. With a single flick of a stylus against a wax tablet, they can adjust your status. A negative mark, a smudge on your record, and the next time you approach the grain distribution office, your tessera token is met with a cold, hollow stare. No grain today, Marcus. Your compliance has been found wanting. You spend your days navigating a labyrinth of unwritten rules. You avoid the wrong streets, you keep your voice low, and you never ever voice a complaint about the price of bread. You are a ghost, right? Moving through a city that demands total visibility. You convince yourself that as long as you stay loyal, as long as you remain a quiet gear in the imperial machine, you will be safe. But you are wrong. The system was never designed to be fair. It was designed to be absolute. And as the empire faced the tightening grip of economic collapse, the state began to look for ways to cut costs by trimming the population. They didn't need a riot to eliminate dissenters, you see. They simply needed a change in the criteria of loyalty. Even the most devout, the most tax-paying, and the most obedient citizens eventually found their names scratched into the ledger for removal. The question that kept the elite of Rome awake at night is the one that now haunts your own thoughts. When the machine finally decides that even the loyal have become an inconvenience, what is left to stop the gears from crushing you? As the grain ships sat stagnant in the harbors of Ostia, a different kind of rot began to set in, not in the wheat, you see, but in the very foundation of Roman society. In the shadow of the great marble forums,
The air grew thick with the metallic tang of desperation. The nota, that invisible, lethal ledger of the state, had become a weapon of war. When the harvests failed, the grain dole, the pulse of Rome's survival, was no longer a right, it was a reward for the worthy. The system, it had reached its breaking point. Imagine walking the Subura, the city's most crowded quarter, and witnessing the silent descent into madness. Here, the wealthiest citizens, stripped of their political standing, found themselves huddled in the dirt, clutching empty bowls. Meanwhile, those who had mastered the art of performative loyalty feasted under the flickering oil lamps, their plates heavy with imports, oblivious to the hollow stares of their dying neighbors.
This was a civil war fought without swords or shields. It was a war of status, where your existence was defined by a mark in a ledger kept by an unseen bureaucrat. Families who had walked the streets of Rome for generations were reduced to ghosts, their names purged from the grain lists by the stroke of a stylus. To be deemed unworthy was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic precision. You were left to waste away in the very shadows of the colossal monuments you helped build, ignored by a city that had decided your utility had expired. The cruelty was not an accident, it was a mechanism of control. By rationing survival based on the capricious whims of the state, the elites ensured that even their rivals were too hungry, too exhausted, and too broken to dare a rebellion. Yet, even in this climate of state-sanctioned starvation, a terrifying realization began to ripple through the lower ranks. The people started to notice that the criteria for survival were shifting, growing smaller and more impossible to meet with every passing day. The very officials who enforced the nota were themselves beginning to disappear from the lists, replaced by newcomers whose only talent was a ruthless devotion to the machine. But just when it seemed the system had perfected its grip, a single catastrophic error was discovered in the imperial records. A flaw that suggested the entire social experiment was built upon a lie far older and more dangerous than any grain shortage. But what exactly did the elites find buried beneath the ruins of the public archives? That, my friends, is where the story takes a turn you truly won't see coming. Beneath the wind-swept ruins of the Forum, the silence is not empty. It is a weight, pressing down on the weathered stones that once dictated the survival of millions. When we walk these paths today, we are not merely looking at the broken architecture of a lost empire. We are staring directly into the mirror of our own civilization. The grain silos, now hollow shells, tell a story that transcends the millennia. They serve as a grim reminder that those who control the bread, those who hold the ledger of who is worthy and who is surplus, have always held the power of life and death. The lead tablets, those cold, clinical records of social standing and state-mandated sustenance, were the ancient precursors to the algorithms that track our digital footprints today. We like to imagine that we have progressed, right? That our modern era is defined by enlightened choice, yet the mechanics of control, they remain chillingly familiar. Whether it is the grain dole of a Roman citizen or the automated rating systems of the 21st century, the goal of the architect remains unchanged: to categorize, to quantify, and ultimately to coerce. The Roman elite knew that a hungry man is a dangerous man, but a man who believes his next meal is dependent on his obedience, well, that is a man who will police himself. As you go about your day, reach into your pocket. You carry a device that acts as your own modern token, a digital record that tracks, scores, and sorts your existence in ways the Caesars of old could only dream of. Are we truly any different from the crowds that gathered in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, desperate for the tokens that ensured their survival? The shadows of the eternal city never truly dissipated. They simply shifted shape, moving from the marketplace into the unseen architecture of the digital age.
History does not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and the echo we hear today is the same one that once hummed through the marble halls of Rome.
If you have ever felt that your own choices are being influenced by the invisible walls of a system you cannot see, you are beginning to understand the true nature of power. Does the social score feel like a relic of a primitive past or a blueprint for our own future? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this journey through the ruins of history has shifted your perspective, consider subscribing to Hidden Epoch Narratives as we continue to uncover the patterns that bind our world to the echoes of the ancient past.